Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the time doctors looked at a screaming infant, reached into their medical bag and pulled out heroin, and everyone in the room thought that was completely reasonable. Not a back alley dealer, not a criminal, a doctor in a waistcoat, with a stethoscope and a medical degree hanging on the wall behind him. He measured out the dose, handed the bottle to the mother, and told her to give it to the baby twice a day, or whenever the crying got bad. The mother thanked him. The pharmacist filled the prescription without blinking, and the baby, within 20 minutes, went very, very quiet. That silence was sold as medicine. For most of the 19th century, across Britain, America, and much of Europe, parents were giving their infants products laced with morphine, heroin, alcohol, and cocaine. Not because they were reckless or cruel, but because the bottle said it was safe, the doctor said it was fine, and the advertisement in the newspaper showed a rosy-cheeked baby sleeping peacefully in a cradle. What could possibly be wrong with that picture? Everything, absolutely everything was wrong with that picture. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Here is what made this possible, and it starts with a problem as old as humanity itself. Babies cry. They cry at 2 a.m, they cry at 4, they cry through breakfast, and they cry through dinner, and they cry with a consistency and volume that seems physically impossible for something that weighs 9 pounds. Every parent across every century of human history has experienced that specific kind of exhaustion, the one that lives behind your eyes and makes you feel like your brain is slowly dissolving. It is not a pleasant feeling. It makes people desperate. And desperate people, when offered a solution, do not ask a lot of questions. In the year 1850, that desperation had a particular texture to it, because Victorian England was not a gentle place to raise a child. London was expanding at a rate that the city's infrastructure could not keep up with. People flooded in from the countryside looking for work, and what they found was a city that was overcrowded, filthy, and completely indifferent to their survival. Working-class families lived in single rooms, sometimes multiple families sharing a single room, in tenements where the walls sweated with damp and the streets outside ran with sewage. Infant mortality was staggering. In the poorest districts of London, nearly 1 in 5 children died before their first birthday. Not from exotic disease, from ordinary poverty, from cold, from malnutrition, from contaminated water, from the sheer grinding weight of being born poor in a city that did not want you. A mother in this world did not have the luxury of staying home with a sick baby. She had to work. Factory shifts ran 12 to 14 hours. Domestic service meant living in someone else's house and being available at all hours. There was no maternity leave, no sick pay, no social safety net of any kind. If you stopped working, you stopped eating. So mothers worked, and babies were left with whoever could be found, an older sibling, a neighbour, a paid caretaker, and the person left in charge of the baby needed the baby to be manageable. That word, manageable, is doing a lot of dark work in this story. Into this world arrived the patent medicine industry, and it arrived with perfect timing. By the 1840s, the British and American markets were flooded with products that promised to solve every domestic problem a family might have: tonics for fatigue, elixirs for digestion, powders for fever, and critically, syrup specifically designed for infants, for colic, for teething pain, for what the Victorians vaguely called irritability of the bowels, which covered everything from gas to genuine illness. These products had names that projected safety and maternal warmth: Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, Steedman's Soothing Powders, Atkinson's Royal Infant's Preservative. The names sound almost sweet, sitting there in the historical record, almost quaint. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce. To put that in context, the standard adult dose of morphine for severe pain today is between 5 and 15 milligrams. A bottle of Mrs. Winslow's given to an infant as directed, a teaspoonful, repeated as needed, was delivering doses that would have floored a grown man. The babies did not complain about the dosage. The babies couldn't complain about anything, because the babies were unconscious. Godfrey's cordial, one of the most popular infant medicines in Britain throughout the 1800s, was essentially laudanum mixed with treacle to make it palatable. Laudanum was tincture of opium, the same substance that had been putting adults to sleep, easing pain and generating addiction for 200 years. Pharmacists in industrial towns reported selling it by the gallon, not by the bottle, by the gallon. Entire neighbourhoods were consuming it, and a significant portion of what was sold went directly to infants. The people selling these products were not hiding what they contained. Not entirely, anyway. Opium in the Victorian era occupied a completely different cultural position than it does now. It was legal. It was widely available. It was sold in pharmacies, grocery stores, and even some general shops without any prescription or age restriction. Laudanum was the Victorian equivalent of aspirin, the thing you reached for when something hurt or when you couldn't sleep. Poets wrote admiringly about it. Doctors prescribed it for conditions ranging from cholera to depression to what they called nervous complaints. Thomas de Quincey had published his famous memoir about opium use in 1821, and while the book described the drug's dark side, it had also made opium seem romantic and literary in a way that didn't exactly discourage experimentation. In this environment, putting opium in a baby's medicine wasn't a scandal. It was a product decision. The scandal, the real, building, slowly emerging scandal, was what happened next. What happened to the babies who were given these products week after week, month after month, as their teeth came in, and the teething was followed by colic, and the colic was followed by more teething, and the soothing syrup became a fixture on the shelf beside the cradle. Some of them became dependent. Dependent infants, when the syrup was delayed or withheld, showed symptoms that would be immediately recognizable to any modern addiction specialist. Tremors, inconsolable crying, sweating, inability to sleep, refusal to eat. Their mothers interpreted these symptoms as evidence that the baby was sick again, and reached for the soothing syrup to help. The syrup calmed the withdrawal. The withdrawal returned when the syrup wore off. The cycle locked in, and some of the babies did not just become dependent, some of them died. The morphine in Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup could suppress the respiratory system of an infant with a small and unpredictable margin of error. Infants who received a slightly larger dose than usual, or infants who were already weakened by illness or malnutrition, simply stopped breathing. They were found in their cradles in the morning, quiet and still, and their deaths were recorded as natural causes. Convulsions, failure to thrive, unknown causes. The language of Victorian death records was elastic enough to absorb a great deal of reality without acknowledging it. Coroners occasionally raised questions. A few doctors, particularly in the second half of the 1800s, began to notice patterns, that infants from households that used certain soothing syrups had a troubling tendency to die unexpectedly. But raising questions in this era meant raising them in a vacuum. There was no Food and Drug Administration. There was no regulatory body with authority over medicines. There was no requirement that ingredients be listed on labels, no toxicology standard for acceptable drug levels in commercial products, no mechanism by which a concerned doctor's observations could be translated into policy. There was only the market, and the market was working perfectly. Sales of infant soothing syrups were enormous, growing every year, and the advertising that supported them was some of the most sophisticated marketing of the 19th century. That advertising deserves its own examination, because it reveals something important about how the industry sustained itself despite the growing body of evidence against it. The advertisements for products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did not simply claim effectiveness. They constructed an entire emotional architecture around the product. They showed mothers relieved and rested. They showed babies sleeping serenely. They carried testimonials from women who described the syrup as nothing short of miraculous. One advertisement described Mrs. Winslow's as the prescription of one of the best female physicians and nurses in the United States. The implied message was clear. This isn't just medicine, it's maternal wisdom, bottled and available at your local pharmacy for 25 cents. 25 cents. That was the price of a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup in the 1870s. The price of quiet, the price of a night's sleep, the price of being able to go to work in the morning without spending the previous 8 hours listening to a baby scream. For a working-class mother who earned perhaps a few shillings a week and had 3 other children to manage, that was not an extravagance. That was arithmetic. What she could not calculate, what nobody was telling her to calculate, was what that bottle was actually doing inside her infant's body. The morphine was crossing the blood-brain barrier of a developing nervous system. It was binding to receptors that were not yet fully formed. It was altering the brain's chemistry in ways that 19th century medicine had no framework to understand, and that 21st century medicine is still working to fully map. The baby felt no pain. The baby felt nothing. That was the whole point. The whole point was also the whole problem. By the 1880s, the British medical press had begun to accumulate enough evidence that something was very wrong. Scattered reports from coroners, letters from concerned physicians, analyses of soothing syrup ingredients conducted by independent chemists who were alarmed by what they found. The picture emerging from these disconnected sources was consistent. Infants were being drugged, some were dying from it. The products responsible were being sold openly and advertised aggressively, and nobody in any position of authority was doing anything about it. In America, the situation was identical, and in some ways worse, because the American patent medicine industry was larger, more aggressive, and more politically connected than its British counterpart. The manufacturers of soothing syrups and infant tonics were not small operations. They were substantial businesses with factory production, national distribution networks, and advertising budgets that made them among the largest single accounts for many American newspapers. That financial relationship had consequences that went far beyond the question of babies and morphine. Those consequences were about to become very difficult to ignore. To understand how an entire society agreed to drug its children for decades without anyone being held accountable, you have to understand what medicine looked like before regulations existed. Not as a quaint historical footnote, but as a fully functioning system, one with its own logic, its own power structures, and its own very effective methods of silencing anyone who got in the way. In the early 1800s, the word pharmacist covered an enormous range of people, from genuinely trained chemists to men who had simply rented a shop, bought some bottles, and started mixing things together. There was no licensing requirement in most of Britain and America that meaningfully distinguished between the two. A person could read a few pamphlets, acquire some basic equipment, and begin selling medicines to the public with no more qualification than confidence and a good location. The public had no reliable way to tell the difference between a skilled professional and a man who was essentially improvising with dangerous chemicals. This was not a secret. It was simply accepted. The patent medicine industry grew out of this environment like a weed through concrete. Fast, opportunistic, and extraordinarily difficult to kill. The term patent medicine is actually a slight misnomer. Most of these products were not patented in the modern sense, because patenting a medicine required disclosing its ingredients and disclosure was the last thing these manufacturers wanted. What they did instead was trademark the name, copyright the label, and keep the formula entirely secret. The product was whatever the manufacturer said it was. The ingredients were listed nowhere. The consumer had absolutely no idea what they were buying, and the law had absolutely no problem with that arrangement. By the 1850s, the American patent medicine industry was generating millions of dollars annually. By the 1880s, it was one of the largest advertising sectors in the country. Products proliferated with a creativity that would be impressive if the context weren't so grim. Peruna, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, Hamlin's wizard oil, Dr. Kilmer's swamp root, Payne's celery compound, and hundreds of others, each promising to cure a slightly different constellation of ailments, each with a backstory designed to project authority and trustworthiness. Some products had fictional doctors behind them, some had fictional female healers, some simply appropriated the word compound or remedy because it sounded medical without requiring any actual medical content. The active ingredients across this landscape were remarkably consistent. Alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, chloroform and arsenic appeared in various combinations across virtually every category of patent medicine. An adult tonic might be 40% alcohol. A cough remedy might contain enough opium to sedate a horse. A women's soothing remedy, the kind marketed for menstrual cramps and female complaints, often contained enough morphine to create physical dependence within a few weeks of regular use. None of this was on the label. None of it needed to be. The newspapers knew. This is the part of the story that tends to get left out of polite historical summaries. The major newspapers of the Victorian and Edwardian era were not innocent bystanders who simply hadn't received the information yet. They received the information. They chose to ignore it, and in many cases they actively suppressed it, because the patent medicine manufacturers were among their most important advertisers. The economics was straightforward and brutal. A large circulation American newspaper in the 1890s might derive 30 to 40% of its total advertising revenue from patent medicine manufacturers. These were not small accounts. They were the accounts that kept the paper solvent, that paid the reporters' salaries, that funded the printing presses. Losing them wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially existential. Patent medicine companies understood this leverage, and they used it with precision. Standard contracts between patent medicine manufacturers and newspapers in the 1890s often contained clauses, called red clauses by the trade, that explicitly voided the advertising contract if the state or local government passed any legislation regulating patent medicines. The newspaper had a direct financial incentive to oppose regulation. Every editorial page that might have demanded reform was instead occupied by advertisements showing happy families and healthy babies. Every reporter who investigated a product's ingredients was working at a paper whose survival depended on that product continuing to be sold without scrutiny. One journalist discovered this arrangement in the most direct way possible. Mark Sullivan, a young American journalist who would later become a prominent political commentator, attempted in the early 1900s to place an expose about patent medicine ingredients in a Boston newspaper. The piece named products, identified their active ingredients, and linked specific formulations to specific deaths. The newspaper's editor, who was personally sympathetic, told Sullivan that he could not run the piece. The paper's patent medicine contracts were too valuable. He suggested Sullivan try somewhere else. Sullivan tried. Several papers turned him down for identical reasons. The financial structure of the American press had effectively created a blackout on the most important consumer safety story of the decade. When Sullivan eventually did get his work published, it was through a magazine that had made a deliberate decision to refuse patent medicine advertising, a decision that cost them significant revenue, but gave them the editorial freedom to print what the newspapers wouldn't touch. That magazine was Collier's Weekly. But the story of what Collier's eventually published belongs to a later chapter, because before the press found its conscience, the industry had more expanding to do. The patent medicine manufacturers were not satisfied with simply selling to adults. The adult market was lucrative, but the infant and child market had a particular advantage. Children got sick constantly. Parents were frightened by childhood illness in ways they weren't frightened by their own, and the emotional stakes of a sick child made parents far less likely to question what was in the bottle they'd been given. A parent who would normally read a label, ask a pharmacist or consult a doctor, might bypass all of that when the baby had been crying for 3 days and the neighbour swore by this particular syrup. So the manufacturers targeted children aggressively. They created entire subcategories of products specifically positioned for infants: teething syrups, colic drops, whooping cough remedies, infant tonics, baby comfort powders. The marketing language for these products was carefully calibrated to speak directly to maternal anxiety. Words like soothing, gentle, natural, and proven appeared in virtually every advertisement. The imagery was always the same: peaceful babies, relieved mothers, quiet nurseries bathed in soft light. The reality in some of those nurseries was considerably darker. A pharmacist in Birmingham named Alfred Fennings sold a product called Fennings' Little Healers, white powders marketed specifically for children's fevers and feverish complaints. The product was widely trusted and widely sold. When independent chemists eventually analysed the powders, they found they contained antimony, a toxic heavy metal that induces vomiting and, in larger doses, causes organ failure. Fennings marketed the vomiting as a therapeutic effect. The product worked in the sense that it produced a dramatic physical response. What it was actually doing was poisoning children. Fennings' Little Healers was not an outlier, it was representative. Across Britain and America, the late 1800s produced an almost surreal catalogue of products given to children that contained substances no responsible person would voluntarily administer to anyone. Soothing powders containing calomel, mercurous chloride, a compound that causes mercury poisoning with extended use, producing symptoms including tooth loss, neurological damage, and in severe cases, death. Cough syrups containing heroin, a word that had not yet acquired its current associations and which Bayer Pharmaceutical was about to introduce to the world as a product name. Teething powders containing chloroform, a compound whose main medical application was general anesthesia. The parents using these products were not negligent. They were trusting a system that had given them no reason not to trust it, and every commercial incentive to believe that the system worked in their interest. The doctor said it was fine, the pharmacist sold it, the newspaper advertised it, the neighbour recommended it. Every institution that might have raised a warning flag was either silent or actively endorsing the product. There was, however, one institution that was beginning to generate inconvenient numbers: the death registries. Victorian Britain had begun requiring formal registration of deaths in 1837, and by the second half of the century, the accumulated data was starting to tell a story that was difficult to dismiss. Infant mortality in industrial cities was catastrophically high. That much had always been known and largely accepted as an unfortunate feature of urban poverty. But within those numbers, certain patterns were emerging. Infants dying in their sleep at rates that exceeded what could be explained by illness alone. Infants dying of convulsions, a catch-all Victorian diagnosis that covered everything from genuine seizures to opiate-induced respiratory depression, at rates that correlated in certain districts with the distribution networks of specific patent medicine products. A statistician named William Farr, working for the General Register Office in London, began tracking these patterns in the 1860s. His work was careful, methodical, and deeply alarming. Farr identified geographic clusters of infant death that matched the commercial footprint of certain soothing syrups. He published his findings in official reports. The reports were read by people in government. Nothing happened, not immediately, not for the reasons one might hope. The industrial and commercial interests arrayed against reform were formidable, and the political will to confront them was, for the moment, entirely absent. But the data was accumulating, and data has a way of eventually becoming impossible to argue with, even for industries that have spent decades and considerable money trying to make the argument disappear. The manufacturers of infant soothing syrups were about to discover that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a regulator with authority. It's a journalist with nothing to lose and a very specific piece of information about what's actually in the bottle. She had a kind face, warm eyes, a gentle smile, the look of a woman who had spent her life caring for children and knew, from long experience, exactly what a suffering infant needed. Her portrait appeared on millions of bottles, in thousands of newspaper advertisements, on posters in pharmacy windows across Britain and America for over 60 years. Mothers trusted her instinctively. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like someone who would never hurt a child. Mrs. Charlotte Winslow did not exist. The face on the bottle was a composite, a marketing invention assembled to project exactly the maternal authority needed to sell a product to anxious mothers. The real origin of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was a businessman named Jeremiah Curtis, who partnered with his son-in-law Benjamin Perkins in the 1840s to manufacture and sell infant medicines. Curtis and Perkins understood something fundamental about their market. Women trusted other women with their children's health far more than they trusted male businessmen. So they invented a woman. They gave her a name that sounded warm and domestic. They gave her a face that projected decades of nurturing experience. They gave her a backstory as a celebrated female physician and nurse who had spent her career perfecting this formula for suffering infants. Then they put 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce into the bottle and started selling it. The product launched in the 1840s and its rise was immediate and remarkable. American sales alone reached enormous figures within the first decade. The formula was simple: morphine sulfate for the sedative effect, sodium carbonate to ease digestion, and a sweetened alcohol base to make the whole thing palatable to an infant palate. It worked exactly as advertised in the narrowest possible sense. It stopped the crying, it eased the teething pain, it helped the baby sleep. The mothers who used it reported miraculous results. Word spread through communities with the speed of genuine enthusiasm because the product genuinely delivered on its central promise. The promise was silence, and silence, in an overcrowded Victorian tenement at 2 a.m, felt very much like salvation. By the 1860s, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was being sold across the United States, Canada, Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. The manufacturers had achieved something extraordinary. They had created a globally recognized brand in an era before global communication infrastructure, before radio, before any of the modern mechanisms of mass marketing. They did it with newspapers, with testimonials, and with a portrait of a woman who had never drawn a single breath. The advertising copy for Mrs. Winslow's was a masterwork of emotional manipulation. One widely printed advertisement described the product as sure to regulate the bowels, to give rest to the mother, and to give health to the child. It assured readers that the syrup was perfectly safe in all cases. Another advertisement, targeted specifically at teething infants, promised relief from pain and spasmodic action and gives rest and health to child and comfort and rest to the mother. The language never mentioned morphine, it never mentioned opium. It spoke only of rest, relief, and the natural order of a healthy baby sleeping peacefully. Meanwhile, coroners in Britain were beginning to write down what they were actually finding. The British medical journal, The Lancet, published its first serious analysis of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup in 1867. The chemists who conducted the analysis were matter-of-fact about their findings. The morphine content was sufficient to sedate an adult, and the recommended infant dosage delivered a concentration that represented a genuine risk of fatal respiratory depression. The Lancet did not use gentle language. It called the product dangerous. It called the dosage irresponsible. It noted that infants who received the syrup regularly showed signs of narcotic dependence when the product was withheld. The manufacturers responded with more advertising. In America, the response to the Lancet's analysis was essentially nothing. American newspapers that depended on Curtis and Perkins' advertising budget did not run the story. American medical journals were slower to engage with the issue than their British counterparts, partly because American medicine in this period was genuinely less organised and less inclined toward collective action. The product continued to sell. The bottles continued to move off pharmacy shelves. The portrait of the woman who never existed continued to smile from newspaper pages across the country. What happened in Britain over the next 2 decades is a study in how slowly institutions move when money is on the other side of the argument. The British Medical Association began formally investigating patent medicines in the 1880s, and Mrs. Winslow's was near the top of their list. Their findings confirmed and amplified what the Lancet had reported. The morphine content was dangerous. The claims on the label were fraudulent. The product was, in the BMA's careful Victorian language, unsuitable for administration to infants. They published their findings. They lobbied Parliament. They submitted evidence to parliamentary committees. Parliament expressed concern. Parliament formed committees. Parliament wrote reports. Nothing was banned. The product's defenders, and there were many because the product had been used by an entire generation of mothers who had watched it work, argued that the complaints were exaggerated, that opium in controlled quantities was a legitimate medicine, that the real danger came from misuse rather than the product itself. This argument has a familiar shape to anyone who has followed drug industry debates in subsequent centuries. The product isn't the problem. The user is the problem. The dose makes the poison. The dose in this case was being administered to 3-month-old infants by exhausted mothers who had no way of knowing that the teaspoon they were measuring was delivering a quantity of morphine that exceeded safe adult parameters. Then came the cases that were impossible to explain away. In 1896, a coroner's inquest in Nottingham examined the death of a 7-month-old infant named William Henry Cope. The child had been healthy, well-fed, and showing no signs of serious illness before his death. His mother had been giving him Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething pain for approximately 3 weeks. The post-mortem found morphine in the child's system at a concentration consistent with the regular dosing schedule described on the bottle. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by morphine poisoning and specifically named Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup in his official finding. The finding was published. British newspapers ran it. Public outrage followed, briefly, intensely, and then subsided as public outrage tends to do. But the inquest had accomplished something structurally important. It had created an official legal record connecting a named product to a named child's death. It was no longer possible for the manufacturers to claim there was no evidence. The evidence now had a name. William Henry Cope, 7 months old, died from a teething medicine his mother had bought at a pharmacy on the high street. The British Parliament finally acted in 1908, when the Pharmacy Act was amended to require that products containing morphine, opium, and certain other substances be labelled as such. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was specifically identified as a product that required updated labelling. The manufacturers complied, technically, They added the required disclosure. Then they reformulated the British version of the product to reduce the morphine content just enough to stay within the new acceptable limits, while keeping the American and Australian formulas unchanged. The product that was now regulated in Britain continued to be sold in its original, higher concentration formula to mothers in the United States for another 2 decades. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a decision. The American market was larger, more profitable, and less regulated, and the manufacturers understood precisely what that combination meant. They had a 2-tier product, a safer version for the country that had looked at the evidence and acted, and the original version for the country that hadn't gotten around to it yet. American sales of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup peaked in the 1890s, declined somewhat in the early 1900s as reform pressure built, and continued in some form until 1930. By the time the product finally disappeared from American pharmacy shelves, it had been in continuous production for approximately 90 years. 3 generations of American infants had been dosed with it. The number of deaths it caused directly will never be precisely known, because Victorian and Edwardian death records were not designed to capture that kind of information. Conservative estimates by medical historians suggest hundreds of deaths, attributable to the product in Britain alone. But Mrs. Winslow's was not even the most dangerous product in this category. It was simply the most famous. Godfrey's cordial, popular particularly in the industrial Midlands and north of England, contained laudanum at concentrations that pharmacists and medical reformers found alarming even by the loose standards of the era. A survey conducted in Nottingham in the 1840s found that nearly 1/3 of all infants in the poorest parishes were regularly receiving Godfrey's cordial. 1/3 of all infants. Receiving a laudanum-based product on a routine basis, administered not by doctors but by neighbours, relatives, and paid childminders who had learned its use from the generation before them. The cordial had become generational knowledge, passed from mother to daughter the way recipes are passed down, as domestic wisdom, as proven practice, as something that worked and therefore needed no further examination. The fact that it worked by rendering infants insensible to their own physical needs, including hunger, was not part of the wisdom being transmitted. Infants on Godfrey's cordial gained weight more slowly than infants not receiving it. They fed less eagerly. They slept more deeply, which looked like contentment but was pharmacologically closer to sedation. In conditions of already marginal nutrition, which described most working-class infants in industrial Britain, this suppression of appetite created a secondary danger that compounded the direct toxicity of the opium. Some of these children were dying not from acute poisoning, but from a slow combination of opiate suppression and malnutrition, and every step of the process looked, from the outside, like an unfortunately sickly baby rather than a poisoned one. The industry had, without ever explicitly planning it, created a system that was nearly perfectly self-concealing. The drug suppressed the symptoms that would signal danger. The deaths it caused were attributed to other causes. The babies who survived were often too small, too slow, too quiet. Outcomes interpreted as constitutional weakness rather than pharmaceutical damage. And the product responsible was in wide, socially endorsed, doctor-adjacent use across the entire society. Somewhere in a London pharmacy, in a New York drugstore, in a general shop in rural Ohio. The bottles sat on shelves with their kind labels and their warm promises and their portraits of women who never existed. And every day mothers reached for them, measured out the doses with domestic confidence, and waited for the crying to stop. It always stopped. There is a particular kind of silence that is more damaging than any lie. It is the silence of people who know, who have the authority to speak, and who choose not to, because speaking would cost them something, and staying quiet cost them nothing. Victorian medicine was full of that silence, and it surrounded the question of infant drug poisoning like a wall. To understand why doctors failed so completely, you have to understand what Victorian medicine was trying to be versus what it actually was. The second half of the 1800s was the period when medicine was attempting its transformation from guesswork into science. Germ theory was emerging, anesthesia had arrived, surgical techniques were improving. There was a genuine, serious effort underway to make medicine evidence-based, systematic and professional, to distinguish the trained physician from the patent medicine huckster in a way that was meaningful rather than merely credentialed. The medical establishment was, in this period, deeply invested in its own legitimacy, which made its behaviour around opiate-based infant medicines all the more revealing. Because the doctors were not ignorant. They knew what opium did. They prescribed it constantly. Laudanum was the Victorian physician's most reliable tool. It eased pain, it suppressed coughs, it calmed anxiety, it treated diarrhea, it helped patients sleep. In an era before antibiotics, before effective anesthesia for non-surgical use, before most of the pharmacological tools that modern medicine takes for granted, opium was genuinely useful in ways that made it difficult to think critically about. A doctor who had watched a patient in agony find relief from laudanum was not naturally inclined to view opium as a poison. It was a medicine, a powerful one, a medicine that required judgment in its application, the kind of judgment that only a trained physician possessed. This self-image was part of the problem. If opium was a medicine that required expert judgment, and if doctors were the experts, then the problem with infant soothing syrups was not the opium, it was the lack of medical supervision. The solution, in this framing, was not to remove opiates from infant medicine. It was to ensure that opiate-based treatments were only administered under a doctor's guidance. This argument conveniently positioned the medical profession as the solution to a crisis it had helped create, while allowing the underlying practice to continue largely unchanged. Doctors prescribed laudanum for teething infants directly, not just tacitly endorsed, directly prescribed. A child presenting with teething pain and associated fever could expect to be sent home with a laudanum-based preparation that differed from Godfrey's cordial mainly in its pedigree. The doctor's version had the authority of a prescription behind it. The effect on the infant's nervous system was identical. The class dimension of this reality was stark and ugly. Wealthy families with private physicians received opiate prescriptions that were carefully worded, occasionally cautious, and came with some degree of professional follow-up. The doctor might visit again. He might adjust the dosage. He might express reservations if the child appeared to be developing dependence. Poor families had none of this. They had druggists who sold whatever moved. They had neighbours who recommended what worked. They had soothing syrups at 25 cents a bottle, and no access to the kind of individualised medical care that might have caught a problem before it became fatal. The babies dying were almost exclusively the babies of the poor. And the medical profession's response to infant opiate deaths was shaped, consciously or not, by a set of class assumptions about whose children's deaths required explanation and whose could be filed under the unfortunate conditions of poverty. Dr. Jonathan Pereira, one of the most respected pharmacologists in mid-Victorian Britain, had published detailed work on the toxicology of opiates that was widely read in medical circles. His analysis of what opium did to the developing nervous system was clear. Doses that an adult could tolerate comfortably could suppress an infant's respiratory function to a dangerous degree. The immature nervous system was more sensitive, the safety margin was narrower, and the consequences of miscalculation were permanent. Pereira published this. It was in the medical literature. Every educated physician in Britain had access to it, and yet the prescriptions continued. The psychology at work was not simple cynicism. Some doctors genuinely believed that the temporary sedation provided by opiates was preferable to the physical stress of prolonged crying, which they thought weakened infants and made them more susceptible to illness. This was not insane on its face. Prolonged distress does have physiological consequences, but it was a rationalization that placed the drug's known benefits in the foreground and its known risks at the back of the room. Other doctors were operating under the influence of an idea that sounds almost comically Victorian until you realize versions of it persist today. The idea that a quiet patient is a healing patient. Rest was considered therapeutic. Sleep was considered restorative. A baby who had been given a dose of laudanum and lay still in its cradle was, in this framework, doing exactly what it needed to do to get better. The fact that the stillness was chemically induced rather than natural was apparently a distinction without a practical difference. Then there were the doctors who simply looked the other way because the alternative was conflict. A physician in an industrial city in 1870 depended on his patients for his income. His patients included the mothers who were using soothing syrups. Telling a working-class woman that the product she'd been relying on for 6 months was poisoning her child was not a simple clinical conversation. It challenged her competence as a mother. It removed the only tool she had for managing an infant while working 14 hours a day. It potentially destroyed whatever trust she had in medicine, because if the syrup was poison and the doctor had said nothing until now, what else had medicine been wrong about? These were real social calculations, and they shaped clinical behaviour in ways that the medical profession did not examine or acknowledge. The doctors who did speak up discovered quickly how isolated that position was. Dr. Charles Ruth presented a paper to the British Medical Association in 1860, arguing that opiate-based infant medicines were responsible for a significant proportion of infant mortality in industrial areas. He named products, he cited cases, he presented mortality statistics cross-referenced with product distribution data that showed a correlation too consistent to be coincidental. The paper was received politely and filed. It generated no formal response from the BMA, no public statement, no recommendation to members about changing prescribing practices. Ruth was not discredited. He was simply ignored, which is a more efficient method of suppression because it requires no effort and leaves no evidence. A decade later, Dr. John Harley published similar findings in The Lancet, with updated data and a more aggressive argument. Harley explicitly called out the medical profession's complicity, not just the patent medicine manufacturers, but the doctors who prescribed opiate preparations to infants without adequate consideration of the risks. He used the word negligence. He did not use it softly. The Lancet published the piece, which gave it more visibility than Ruth's BMA paper, and the response from the medical establishment was roughly equivalent: polite acknowledgement and continued inaction. What would have been required to break this pattern was not more evidence. There was already enough evidence. What was required was a mechanism for translating evidence into institutional change, a regulatory body, a liability framework, a professional accountability structure with actual teeth. None of these existed in any meaningful form. The General Medical Council, established in 1858 to regulate British doctors, had no authority over prescribing practices for legal substances. A doctor could prescribe laudanum to an infant, the infant could die, and the doctor faced no professional consequence whatsoever, provided he hadn't done something dramatic enough to constitute obvious misconduct. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, protecting practitioners, protecting manufacturers, and absorbing the deaths of infants as an acceptable operating cost. Meanwhile, the industrial cities kept growing. The tenements kept filling. The factories kept running their 14-hour shifts, and in the cramped, damp rooms where working-class families lived and slept and tried to survive, the bottles of soothing syrup kept being opened, The doses kept being measured, and the babies kept going quiet in ways their mothers interpreted as rest. Some of those mothers began to notice over time that rest looked different than it had before they started using the syrup, that the baby was harder to wake, that it fed less eagerly, that it cried in a different way when the syrup was late, a thinner, more desperate sound, less like hunger, and more like something else, something that didn't have a name yet in any language a Victorian mother had been given access to. The name for it was withdrawal. But that word belonged to a future that hadn't been written yet, and the mothers experiencing it were doing so entirely alone, with no framework to understand what they were seeing, and no doctor who was going to tell them the truth. The truth was being written down, in careful Victorian script, in the death records of every industrial city in Britain and America. Convulsions. Wasting. Unknown causes. Natural causes. The registry accumulated its numbers with bureaucratic patience, waiting for someone with the right combination of access, authority, and willingness to pick up the thread and pull. That someone was not going to come from the medical establishment. It was going to come from somewhere much stranger, from a laboratory in Germany, where a pharmaceutical company was about to make an announcement that would reshape the entire conversation about opiates, children, and the definition of a safe medicine. In 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company of Elberfeld, Germany, introduced a new product to the global medical market. They named it Heroin. The name was derived from the German word heroisch, heroic, because the compound made patients feel, in the words of the researchers who tested it, strong and powerful. Bayer was not a fringe operation. It was one of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in the world, the same company that had introduced aspirin to the market that same year. When Bayer said a drug was safe, the medical community listened. What Bayer was actually selling was diacetyl morphine. Morphine that had been chemically modified to cross the blood-brain barrier approximately twice as fast as morphine itself. The effect was morphine, but faster, stronger, and more intense. The researchers who developed it had noticed that patients who took it reported feeling an immediate and profound sense of well-being. They had interpreted this as evidence that the drug was effective. It was evidence of something else entirely. Bayer's chief pharmacologist, Heinrich Drieser, had conducted the clinical trials that preceded the product's launch. The trials showed that heroin suppressed coughs more effectively than codeine, reduced respiratory distress in patients with tuberculosis and bronchitis, and produced a calming effect that made anxious or agitated patients easier to manage. Drieser concluded that heroin was a superior alternative to morphine for all these applications, with one critical additional advantage. He reported that it was non-addictive. That claim was not supported by his own data. Drieser's trials had been short, weeks, not months. The patients who received heroin during the trial period had not been followed long enough to show the full pattern of physical dependence that opiate use produces. Drieser either did not recognize this limitation or chose not to emphasize it. His published findings presented heroin as a breakthrough, a powerful therapeutic compound without the dependency risks of morphine. It was, he wrote, the answer to one of medicine's most persistent problems: how to treat pain and respiratory distress without creating addiction. The medical establishment received this news with enthusiasm verging on relief. Morphine addiction was a recognized and growing problem by the late 1890s. The Civil War in America had left hundreds of thousands of veterans dependent on morphine, administered during and after surgery, with a generosity that reflected the era's incomplete understanding of addiction physiology. The condition was common enough to have acquired a name, soldier's disease, and it was understood to be a genuine medical crisis with no clear solution. If heroin was truly non-addictive, it was not just a new drug. It was an exit ramp from the morphine addiction epidemic that medicine had accidentally created. Bayer moved quickly. Within a year of the product's launch, they had distributed free samples to physicians across Europe and America, over 10,000 samples in the United States alone. Medical journals in multiple languages published favourable reviews. Conferences featured papers on heroin's therapeutic applications. The drug was recommended for tuberculosis, bronchitis, asthma, coughs, anxiety, and, because the logic seemed sound, as a treatment for morphine addiction. Giving a morphine addict heroin to wean them off morphine was, in retrospect, roughly equivalent to treating someone's whiskey problem with pure grain alcohol. But the logic was seductive, and the endorsements were coming from credentialed researchers at reputable institutions. Then heroin arrived in the children's ward, and nobody considered this unusual. Childhood respiratory illness was a leading cause of death in the late 19th century. Tuberculosis, whooping cough, bronchitis, and pneumonia killed children in enormous numbers, and the coughing associated with these diseases was not just distressing, it was physically damaging, exhausting, and in severe cases directly contributed to deterioration. A drug that effectively suppressed coughing was a legitimate therapeutic tool for these conditions. Heroin suppressed coughing with remarkable efficiency. It also, of course, sedated the patient, reduced respiratory drive, and delivered the neurological impact of a powerful opiate to a developing child's brain. But the coughing stopped. The child rested. The parents were relieved. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, a publication of considerable authority, published a clinical report in 1900 recommending heroin as a cough suppressant for children with bronchitis and tuberculosis. The recommended dosage was calibrated for adult use and noted that smaller doses should be used for children, but the fundamental recommendation was clear. Heroin was an appropriate pediatric medicine. It took less than 3 years for the first alarm bells to ring. By 1901, physicians in Europe and America were beginning to notice something troubling about their heroin patients. Patients who had been prescribed heroin for coughs or respiratory conditions were returning to request more. They were not returning because their coughs had worsened. They were returning because they needed the drug. Some were anxious, irritable, and physically unwell when the prescription ran out. Some were obtaining heroin from multiple doctors simultaneously. Some had begun to seek it from non-medical sources. These were the symptoms of addiction. Every physician who had dealt with morphine dependence recognized them immediately. The patients behaving this way around heroin were behaving identically to patients who had developed morphine addiction. Bayer received reports of these cases. The volume of reports grew through 1902 and 1903. Individual physicians began writing to medical journals raising concerns. The pattern was too consistent, coming from too many different locations and too many different types of patients, to be attributed to individual patient characteristics or prescribing errors. Inside Bayer, people knew. The internal documentation that would later emerge through historical research showed that Bayer's medical director was receiving and reading these reports in real time. The company's representatives were gathering information from physicians across the distribution network. By approximately 1903, there was enough internal evidence to establish with reasonable confidence that heroin caused physical dependence in a significant proportion of patients who used it regularly. Bayer continued marketing heroin as non-addictive until 1913. For a full decade after the company had accumulated internal evidence of the drug's addiction potential, their marketing materials, their physician communications, and their product literature continued to describe heroin as a safe, non-habit-forming alternative to morphine. During those 10 years, the drug embedded itself in the medical practice of 2 continents. It became a standard item in physicians' bags. It appeared in home medicine chests. It was given to children with coughs, to adults with anxiety, to recovering morphine addicts who are now addicted to something worse, and to anyone who presented to a doctor with a problem that heroin's sedating, euphoric properties could temporarily suppress. The patient populations being created by this decade of knowing mismarketing were not trivial in size. American medical estimates from the early 1910s suggested that heroin addiction had become a significant urban public health problem, concentrated particularly in cities and among populations who had been exposed to medical prescriptions that never came with any warning about dependency risk. Bayer finally acknowledged the addiction problem publicly in 1913 and discontinued the heroin product line. They did so not as a moral decision, but as a commercial one. The legal and reputational landscape had shifted enough that continuing to market the product was more costly than withdrawing it. By 1913, the American Medical Association had reversed its earlier endorsements of heroin for pediatric use, and several states were moving toward legislation restricting the drug's availability. The withdrawal from the market did not remove the drug from circulation. By 1913, heroin was being manufactured by other companies, synthesized in independent laboratories, and distributed through channels that had nothing to do with Bayer's pharmacy network. The addiction epidemic that Bayer's decade of deception had helped fuel was now self-sustaining. The patients who had been created by legitimate medical prescriptions were seeking supply wherever they could find it. What Bayer had done, in the most precise mechanical sense, was this. They had taken a population that had no exposure to heroin, introduced the drug to them through the trusted channel of medical prescription, generated physical dependence in a substantial number of those people, lied about the dependence risk for 10 years, while the dependent population grew, and then withdrawn the legitimate supply while leaving the dependent population entirely without support. The street market that emerged to fill the gap was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a corporate decision made in a boardroom in Elberfeld by people who had read the reports and calculated that continued sales were worth more than discontinued harm. Heinrich Drieser, the pharmacologist who had declared heroin non-addictive, died in 1924. He had spent his final years as a heroin addict. The drug he had described as the answer to morphine dependency had given him exactly the condition he had promised it would prevent. There was no court that tried him for this, no professional body that stripped his credentials, no monument to the patients his work had damaged. He died as he had lived, a respected scientist who had made a mistake with global consequences and faced no meaningful accountability for it. In the years between Bayer's market withdrawal and the first serious drug control legislation, heroin moved through American and European society in ways that the patent medicine industry's earlier products never had. The soothing syrups had been domestic, quiet, absorbed into the rhythms of household life. Heroin's addiction was louder, more visible. It appeared on street corners and in newspaper headlines, and in the testimony of physicians who were watching their patient populations deteriorate in ways they hadn't anticipated and couldn't reverse. The drug had escaped the nursery and the medicine cabinet, and was now operating at a scale that even the most determined institutional silence couldn't contain. Morphine and heroin were not working alone. While the soothing syrup industry was quietly sedating the infant population of the industrialized world, an entire parallel ecosystem of child-targeted drug products had been growing alongside it, each one solving a specific childhood complaint with a specific poison, each one marketed with the same cheerful confidence, each one moving through the same unregulated market with the same complete absence of consequence. The full catalogue of what was being sold to children in the Victorian and Edwardian era reads less like a historical record and more like a dark satire, except that every item in it was real, was widely sold, and was trusted by the people who bought it. Lloyd's cocaine toothache drops arrived on the American market in the 1880s with packaging that featured a small child receiving the product from a kindly adult, the image of domestic care, bottled and labelled. The active ingredient was cocaine hydrochloride, dissolved in a solution that could be applied directly to aching gums or swallowed. Cocaine is a powerful local anaesthetic, which meant the product genuinely worked for toothache pain in the immediate sense. It numbed the area. The child stopped crying about the tooth. For approximately 20 minutes, the product delivered exactly what it promised. What it also delivered was a dose of cocaine to a child's developing nervous system, followed by the stimulant rebound that cocaine reliably produces, elevated heart rate, agitation, and a baseline physiological disruption that parents interpreted as the child getting worked up again, rather than experiencing a pharmacological after effect. Some parents gave another dose. The cycle was obvious in retrospect. At the time, it was simply Tuesday. Cocaine's incorporation into child medicine followed a pattern identical to heroin's: initial endorsement by credentialed researchers, enthusiastic medical adoption, commercial expansion, and a long tail of evidence accumulating before any institutional response occurred. Carl Kohler's 1884 demonstration that cocaine was an effective local anaesthetic had opened the medical world's eyes to its therapeutic potential, and the pharmaceutical industry had moved with remarkable speed to commercialize that potential across every application it could conceive. If cocaine numbed the eye during surgery, it would surely numb a child's sore gum. The logic was direct, the product development was fast, and the safety evaluation was essentially non-existent. Steedman's soothing powders occupied a different corner of the market, positioned as a gentler, more refined alternative to liquid syrups, targeted at slightly more prosperous households that might find the association with laudanum-based products uncomfortable. The powders were small, white, neatly packaged, and they contained calomel, mercurous chloride, a compound of mercury used as a purgative and general medicine since the 17th century. Mercury poisoning produces a symptom profile that is, in certain stages, superficially indistinguishable from the childhood illnesses it was meant to treat: fever, irritability, loss of appetite, disrupted sleep. The calomel was causing the very symptoms that justified its continued administration, which meant that parents who noticed their child deteriorating after the powders were started would often increase the dose rather than stop it. The condition had a name: pink disease, or acrodynia, characterized by painful red extremities, extreme irritability, profuse sweating, and neurological symptoms. It was epidemic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, afflicting thousands of children annually, and its cause was entirely opaque to the medical profession until the 1950s, when a researcher named Joseph Warkani finally established the definitive link to mercury exposure through calomel-containing powders. The powders had been in use for over a century before anyone officially connected them to the disease they were causing. Atkinson's infant's preservative, a name that sounds more like a pickling solution than a medicine, contained alcohol in concentration sufficient to produce intoxication in small infants. The product was marketed as a general tonic and digestive aid, and it was given to babies as young as a few weeks old. Alcohol's effect on an infant's developing liver and nervous system is considerably more severe than on an adult's, but the Victorians did not have a clear framework for thinking about developmental toxicology. The idea that a substance could be relatively safe for adults while being actively harmful to developing organisms. They gave infants alcohol-based medicines with the same confidence they gave adults wine for digestion, because the distinction did not yet exist in practical medical thinking. Chlorodyne was another product that existed at the profitable intersection of legitimate medicine and casual poisoning. Formulated by Dr. John Collis Brown in the 1850s, chlorodyne contained morphine, cannabis, and chloroform in a combination that its creator described as a treatment for cholera, diarrhea, and pain. It worked, in the sense that an unconscious person doesn't experience cholera symptoms particularly acutely. Multiple manufacturers produced competing versions under the same name, each with slightly different formulations, none of which were disclosed on the label. Chlorodyne was given to children for coughs, for diarrhea, for teething, and because it contained chloroform, which is primarily used as a general anaesthetic, the children who received larger doses didn't just sleep, they lost consciousness entirely. Parents reported this as the medicine working very well. The phenomenon of overlaying sits at the darkest intersection of all these products and requires examination with clear eyes. Overlaying was the Victorian term for the accidental death of an infant in a shared bed. The official explanation being that the sleeping parent had rolled onto the child and caused suffocation. It was common enough to be a recognised category of death in Victorian records, and it was treated as a tragic but unremarkable domestic accident. Except that many of these deaths were not accidents in the way the word implies. Infants who had been dosed with opiate-based soothing syrups were profoundly sedated, far beyond the light sleep of a healthy infant, which is characterized by frequent movement and easy arousal. An infant sedated with morphine would not rouse when a parent moved in bed. It would not cry out. It would not instinctively protect its airway with the normal reflexes that healthy infant sleep involves. The neurological suppression that made the baby sleep so well also removed the biological safeguards that would ordinarily prevent a healthy baby from dying in that situation. The coroners who recorded these deaths as overlaying were not necessarily wrong about the mechanism of death. Suffocation may well have been the proximate cause, but the underlying cause, the reason the infant did not respond, did not move, did not survive what a healthy infant might have survived, was the morphine. The soothing syrup had not killed the baby in the direct sense. It had simply ensured the baby could not save itself. This distinction was either not grasped or not recorded, and thousands of infant deaths that were pharmacologically enabled were officially categorized as domestic accidents. The people who understood this most clearly were not doctors or regulators. They were pharmacists, the men who actually compounded and sold these products, who handled the raw ingredients daily, who knew what was in the bottles and in roughly what quantities. Some of them were deeply uncomfortable. Private correspondence and diary entries from Victorian chemists reveal individuals who were genuinely conflicted about what they were selling, who worried about the doses being given to infants, who suspected the products were causing deaths they were seeing reflected in their community. But the pharmacists were also businessmen. Patent medicines were high-margin products with consistent demand. The customer who bought Mrs. Winslow's this week would be back next week for another bottle. The economic incentive to keep selling was direct and immediate. The ethical incentive to stop was abstract and personal, and came with a financial cost. The few pharmacists who did raise formal concerns, writing to medical journals, reporting cases to local medical officers of health, were met with the same reception that had greeted Ruth and Harley and every other individual who had tried to translate evidence into action. Polite acknowledgement, institutional inertia, the grinding silence of a system that was financially comfortable exactly as it was. What the system had produced by the end of the 19th century was not a collection of isolated harmful products, but a comprehensive infrastructure of child drugging that touched virtually every social class, every type of childhood complaint, and every commercial channel through which medicine was distributed. The poor had their soothing syrups and their Godfrey's cordial. The middle class had their Steedman's powders and their chlorodyne. The wealthy had their private physicians who prescribed laudanum with a more refined hand, but prescribed it nonetheless. The drugs were different. The dosages varied. The packaging ranged from crude to elegant. But the core transaction was the same everywhere. A suffering child, a frightened parent, a product that promised relief, and a system designed to ensure that nobody who knew the full truth about that product was in a position to tell the parent buying it. The death toll accumulating in the registry offices of Birmingham and Manchester and New York and Chicago was enormous, silent, and distributed across enough different official causes of death that it remained invisible as a unified phenomenon. Nobody had yet added it up in a way that produced a number large enough to be politically impossible to ignore. That calculation was coming, and the person who was going to make it was not a doctor, not a pharmacist, and not a government official. He was a journalist with a magazine that had made the commercially ruinous decision to stop taking patent medicine advertising, which meant, for the first time, that someone with a printing press and a national audience had absolutely nothing to lose by telling the truth. Before the journalists arrived and the legislators stirred and the reformers began producing their pamphlets, there was a quieter catastrophe running underneath the visible one. It involved women, specifically the women at the bottom of the Victorian economic order, and it reveals something about this entire era that the history of patent medicines alone cannot fully capture. The working-class Victorian mother occupied a position of almost impossible structural contradiction. She was held responsible, by every social and moral standard of her era, for the health and welfare of her children. Motherhood was the Victorian woman's highest calling, her defining purpose, the measure by which her character and worth were publicly assessed. A good mother produced healthy children. A bad mother produced sick ones. The logic was that simple, and it was applied with that brutality. At the same time, economic reality required that same mother to leave her children for 12 to 14 hours a day and go work in a factory, a laundry, a shop, or someone else's house. She had no choice. The rent required it. The food required it. Survival required it. She left before dawn and returned after dark, and in the hours between, her children were managed by whoever was available, usually an older sibling, a neighbour, or, for those who could spare a few pennies, a paid childminder. These childminders were the front line of the soothing syrup culture, and understanding what their situation actually looked like is essential to understanding why the drugging of infants became so systematic. A woman minding children for pay in 1870 might be responsible for 4, 5, or 6 infants simultaneously in a single room for a fee of a few pennies per child per day. She had no training, no equipment, no medical knowledge, and no support. Her income depended on accepting more children than she could comfortably manage. The only tool she had for keeping multiple infants quiet and manageable through a 10-hour day was the soothing syrup. It was cheap, it was available, and it worked with a reliability that nothing else in her limited arsenal could match. She was not villainous. She was rational within a system that had left her no better options. The practice extended into a darker institution that the Victorians had created almost inadvertently: baby farming. Baby farming was the paid, long-term care of infants, sometimes for weeks or months, sometimes permanently, by women who accepted children from parents who could not or would not care for them. Some baby farmers were simply overwhelmed childminders, some were running informal orphanages, and some, a number that was small in proportion to the total but enormous in absolute terms, were running something considerably more sinister. For a baby farmer operating at the criminal end of the spectrum, an infant represented an income stream with an associated cost. The fee was paid up front or in installments, and the cost was the food, the space, and the attention the infant required. Any reduction in those costs increased the profit. Soothing syrups reduced the costs in several ways simultaneously. They reduced the infant's appetite, which reduced feeding costs. They reduced the infant's crying, which reduced the attention required. and they reduced the infant's overall vitality in ways that, if the dosing was heavy enough and consistent enough, eventually reduced the infant's survival. This was not hypothetical. It was documented, investigated, and prosecuted, occasionally. Amelia Dyer was the most notorious baby farmer in British history, and her case illuminated the full horror of what the soothing syrup culture had made possible as cover. Dyer operated in Bristol, London, and Reading over a period of approximately 30 years, from the 1860s until her arrest in 1896. She accepted infants from desperate mothers, often unmarried women, domestic servants, women whose pregnancies had been the result of assault or economic coercion, and advertised herself as a respectable childminder with experience and Christian values. The infants placed in Dyer's care disappeared. Not all of them, not immediately, but in numbers that should have triggered investigation long before it actually came. Dyer had developed a method of operation that exploited every weakness in the Victorian oversight system simultaneously. She moved frequently, operating under different names in different cities, making it difficult for any single registrar or local official to accumulate enough information about her to act. When infants in her care died, she used the same loose Victorian death certification system that had been absorbing patent medicine deaths for decades. The causes recorded as natural, the investigations cursory, the paperwork processed without scrutiny. The soothing syrup culture was not incidental to Dyer's operation. It was structural. The broad social acceptance of sedating infants with opiate products meant that an infant in Dyer's care who was perpetually sedated, slow to develop, and failing to thrive, was displaying symptoms consistent with how many people thought infants in the care of soothing syrup simply looked. The drug had normalized a presentation of infant illness that might otherwise have raised immediate alarm. Dyer was eventually caught not through any systematic monitoring of infant welfare, but through the discovery of infant bodies in the River Thames, wrapped in paper packages, weighted with stones, the paper traceable back to Dyer through a partially visible address. She was tried, convicted, and hanged in 1896. The investigation that followed her arrest estimated that she may have killed over 400 infants over the course of her career. 400. The number was large enough that it generated genuine public horror, and public horror generated newspaper coverage, and newspaper coverage briefly illuminated the baby farming phenomenon in a way that made it impossible to pretend the problem was confined to one aberrant individual. Dyer was extreme. But the conditions that made her operation possible, the desperate mothers, the absent oversight, the cultural normalization of infant sedation, the death registration system that couldn't distinguish a murdered baby from one that had simply failed to thrive, were not extreme at all. They were ordinary. They were systemic. And when the public horror faded, they remained. The institutional response to the baby farming scandals of the 1860s and 1890s was the Infant Life Protection Act, passed in 1872 and strengthened in 1897, which required the registration of women caring for infants for pay and established some minimal oversight of these arrangements. The legislation was a genuine step. It was also, in practical terms, inadequate to the scale of the problem it addressed, underfunded, inconsistently enforced, and easily circumvented by the simple expedient of not registering. What the legislation did not address at all was the question of the drugs. The Infant Life Protection Acts were concerned with the custody and physical safety of infants in paid care. They required registration. They permitted inspection. They did not prohibit the use of soothing syrups, did not regulate the products being administered to the infants under their protection, and did not require childminders or baby farmers to disclose what they were giving to children in their care. The opiate products that had enabled the worst abuses of the baby farming system continued to be sold, continued to be used and continued to be administered to infants across every type of childcare arrangement, from the responsible to the criminal. The women who lost children to this system, to the syrups, to the baby farmers, to the impossible arithmetic of Victorian working-class survival, were not compensated, not acknowledged, and in many cases actively blamed. A mother whose infant died in a baby farmer's care was as likely to face social condemnation for having placed the child there as she was to receive sympathy. The moral architecture of Victorian womanhood held mothers responsible for outcomes they had been given no structural power to control. A factory worker earning survival wages, working 14 hours a day, who placed her infant with a registered childminder, who used standard, commercially available soothing syrup, and whose infant died of opiate suppression, that woman had done everything the system permitted her to do. There was no version of her circumstances in which a better decision was available. And yet the narrative that emerged in newspaper coverage, in coroner's commentary, and in the social discourse of the era located the failure in her choice, her oversight, her inadequacy as a mother, rather than in the product, the market, the legislation that didn't exist, or the economic system that had put her in that position in the first place. Blame flowed downward with the efficiency of gravity. The manufacturers who produced the syrups were never charged. The chemists who sold them without warning were never prosecuted. The newspapers that advertised them while suppressing the evidence against them were never held to account. The doctors who prescribed opiate preparations to infants and said nothing when the pattern of deaths became visible were never disciplined. The mothers buried their children and went back to work because the rent was still due. That is the part of this history that the reformers' pamphlets and the legislators' debates and the medical journal articles almost never addressed directly. Not because it was invisible, but because addressing it honestly would have required a systemic critique that implicated too many powerful institutions simultaneously. It was easier to focus on the products could be regulated, the economic system that made mothers dependent on those products was considerably harder to touch. The reformers were coming, the legislation was coming. But it was coming for the bottles, not for the conditions that had made the bottles necessary in the first place. Harvey Washington. Wiley was not a gentleman in his convictions. The chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture from 1883 onward, Wiley had spent 2 decades watching the American food and drug supply operate as an open market for fraud, contamination, and outright poison, and he had the data to prove it. He was methodical, relentless, and possessed of the particular stubbornness that long institutional fights tend to either produce or destroy. In Wiley's case, the fight produced it in abundance. Wiley's approach to reform was unusual for its era because it was empirical before it was political. He did not begin with moral arguments about the wickedness of patent medicine manufacturers. He began with chemistry. His Bureau of Chemistry systematically analyzed the contents of food and drug products sold in the American market and published the results in a series of reports that were, by the standards of government documents, remarkably readable and remarkably damning. Preservatives that caused kidney damage, food colorings derived from coal tar, drug products whose stated ingredients bore no relationship to their actual contents. The patent medicine industry was a particular target, and the results of Wiley's analyses were specific enough to be impossible to dismiss as generalized complaint. Products that claimed to contain only herbal ingredients contained morphine. Products marketed as alcohol-free contained enough alcohol to constitute a significant intoxicant. Infant-soothing syrups contained opiate concentrations that Wiley's chemists measured and recorded with precision, and the numbers were stark enough that any physician who read them could calculate the risk themselves. Wiley began lobbying for federal food and drug legislation in the late 1880s. He would not see it passed for nearly 20 years. The opposition he faced was not disorganized or unsophisticated. The patent medicine industry had by this point constructed what amounted to a professional lobbying operation, funded by the largest manufacturers and directed with strategic clarity at the precise mechanisms by which legislation could be stopped. Congressional committees were the choke point, and the committees were populated by legislators from states where patent medicine manufacturing was economically significant. Campaign contributions flowed toward these legislators with the consistency and reliability of a revenue stream, because for the manufacturers, that is precisely what they were. The newspaper lobby reinforced the pharmaceutical one. Editors and publishers who depended on patent medicine advertising made their position clear to their congressional representatives through the same channels of influence that all large commercial interests used. The message was consistent. Regulation would destroy a legitimate industry, cost jobs, reduce press revenue, and represent government overreach into the marketplace. These arguments were not new, and they were not unique to this industry. They were the standard arguments deployed against every attempt to regulate commercial behavior, and they worked with a consistency that must have been deeply discouraging to Wiley and the people working alongside him. Congress killed the Pure Food and Drug Bill in 1880, then in 1882, then in 1884, then in 1886. The bill was introduced, debated, sent to committee, and quietly buried with a regularity that would have been impressive if it weren't infuriating. Each cycle, Wiley gathered more evidence. Each cycle, the industry gathered more lobbying resources. For nearly 2 decades, the evidence was losing. Then Collier's Weekly entered the fight, and the dynamic shifted. Collier's had made the decision in the early 1900s to refuse patent medicine advertising. It was a financially painful choice. The magazine sacrificed a significant portion of its revenue, but it gave the publication something no major newspaper in America possessed: the ability to print the truth about patent medicines without commercial consequence. The editor, Norman Hapgood, understood that this independence was a competitive advantage in a media landscape where every other publication was compromised, and he used it deliberately. Samuel Hopkins Adams was the journalist Hapgood assigned to the story. Adams was 34 years old, methodical, and angry in a way that translated directly into prose. Over the course of 1905, he conducted an investigation that was remarkable in its scope and its specificity. He didn't just analyse products. He traced the commercial relationships between manufacturers, newspapers, and legislators. He identified the specific red clause contracts that prevented papers from covering the story. He named the newspapers, he named the advertisers, he named the products and their ingredients. The series ran in Collier's under the title The Great American Fraud, beginning in October 1905. It ran for 11 installments over the following year. The first piece opened with a sentence that became famous in American journalism. The patent medicine industry, Adams wrote, was predatory fraud, operating at a national scale, protected by a corrupted press, and killing Americans with a systematic efficiency that any government should find intolerable. The public response was extraordinary, not because Americans had been unaware that patent medicines were problematic. There had been scattered reporting, individual exposés, and persistent rumours about ingredients for years, but because nobody had previously laid out the entire system in one place, with names, numbers, and specific documentation. Adams's series didn't just identify bad products, it identified a bad system and named every participant in it. The manufacturers responded with the tools they had always used: advertising pressure, legal threats, and political lobbying. Several papers that attempted to cover Adams' findings were contacted by their patent medicine advertisers and reminded of their contractual obligations. One manufacturer filed a libel suit against Collier's. The suit went nowhere. Adams's documentation was thorough enough that the legal challenge was more of a harassment tactic than a genuine claim. But it consumed time and resources and sent a signal to other journalists about the cost of engagement. What the manufacturers could not control was the timing. Adams' series ran precisely when Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was generating national revulsion about the American food supply, the contaminated meat, the fraudulent labelling, the industrial indifference to consumer safety. The two stories amplified each other in the public consciousness in a way that created political pressure neither could have generated alone. The specific horror of what was in the meat combined with the specific horror of what was in the medicine to produce a generalized, urgent, and for once politically actionable demand for federal oversight of what Americans were putting in their bodies. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had been cautiously supportive of food and drug reform without committing to specific legislation, read Sinclair's book and was reported to have thrown his breakfast across the room in disgust. Whether or not the detail is precisely accurate, his political response was real. He applied executive pressure to Congress in a way he had not previously been willing to do, and the legislative calculus changed. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed in June 1906. Wiley, who had spent 20 years fighting for it, considered the moment one of the most significant of his career. It was. And it was also, in ways that would become apparent almost immediately, deeply inadequate to the problem it was meant to solve. The Act required that products containing alcohol, opiates, cocaine, cannabis, chloroform and certain other substances list those ingredients on their labels. It did not ban any of these substances from commercial drug products. It did not set maximum concentrations. It did not require safety testing. It did not establish any mechanism for removing a dangerous product from the market. It created a disclosure requirement and called it consumer protection. The manufacturers adapted with remarkable speed. Most of them simply added the required disclosures to their existing labels. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup began listing its morphine content. The listing didn't reduce sales immediately or dramatically. Consumers who had trusted the product for years continued to trust it, and the presence of morphine sulfate on the label was, for many buyers, simply a confirmation that the medicine was serious and effective. Wiley's reaction to the final text of the Act was a mixture of relief and frustration that he documented extensively in his correspondence. The law was better than nothing. It was substantially worse than what he'd asked for. The compromises that had been required to get it through Congress had stripped out the provisions with the most actual protective power, leaving a framework that was legally significant but practically weak. The pharmaceutical lobby had lost the battle over disclosure and won the battle over everything that mattered. One senator, during the committee hearings that shaped the final bill, had argued against mandatory ingredient listing on the grounds that it would unduly alarm the public about products that had been safely used for generations. The products that had been used for generations contained enough morphine to kill infants and enough cocaine to addict adults. The senator's concern for public alarm was, in context, one of the more remarkable statements in the legislative history of American consumer protection. It was not an unusual concern for its era. It was the standard position of an industry that had spent decades cultivating the idea that ignorance was safety, that consumers who didn't know what was in the bottle were consumers who wouldn't worry about what was in the bottle, and consumers who didn't worry bought more bottles. The 1906 Act had cracked that architecture, but it hadn't demolished it. The system was wounded. It was not done. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act had labelled the poison. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was supposed to control it. What it actually did was something considerably more complicated, and in certain specific ways, considerably more damaging than either its architects intended or its opponents feared. To understand the Harrison Act, you have to understand the political environment that produced it, because the law's shape was determined less by public health reasoning than by international diplomacy, domestic racial anxiety, and the particular limitations of what the federal government believed it was constitutionally permitted to do. The international dimension came first. In 1909, the United States hosted the International Opium Commission in Shanghai. A gathering of 13 nations convened to address the global opium trade, which had become politically embarrassing in ways that had nothing to do with infant soothing syrups and everything to do with colonial economics. Britain had spent decades forcing opium on China through 2 military conflicts now known, with remarkable directness, as the Opium Wars. By 1909, the consequences of that policy were visible enough that the major powers felt compelled to at least appear to be addressing them. The Shanghai Commission produced agreements. The agreements required domestic legislation. The Harrison Act was, in its original political conception, America's implementation of an international commitment rather than a response to a domestic crisis. This origin shaped everything about how the law was written. The Harrison Act did not ban opiates. The federal government's lawyers believed, with considerable justification, given the constitutional framework of the era, that a direct federal ban on a commercial substance would not survive legal challenge. What the government could do was tax. So the Harrison Act was structured as a tax and record-keeping measure. Anyone who produced, imported, manufactured or distributed opiates or coca products was required to register with the Treasury Department, pay a nominal tax, and maintain records of all transactions. Physicians could prescribe these substances to patients in the course of professional practice. Pharmacists could dispense them with a valid prescription. The nominal tax was 1 cent per ounce. The language that would generate the most catastrophic consequences was a single phrase describing legitimate medical prescription. Physicians could dispense opiates in the course of his professional practice only. It sounded reasonable. It was, in practice, a sentence whose ambiguity would be resolved by Treasury Department enforcement agents in a way that destroyed thousands of lives. The Enforcement Division of the Treasury, the forerunner of what would become the Drug Enforcement Administration, interpreted professional practice to exclude the maintenance prescribing of opiates to addicted patients. A physician who prescribed morphine to a patient for acute pain was practicing medicine. A physician who prescribed morphine to an addicted patient to manage their dependence and prevent withdrawal was, in the Treasury's reading, simply supplying a drug habit. That was not medicine. That was a crime. This interpretation was not what Congress had intended. The legislative history is clear enough on that point that it's difficult to argue otherwise. Several congressional supporters of the Harrison Act explicitly stated during debate that it was not meant to interfere with medical treatment of addiction. But intention and enforcement are different documents, and enforcement was what people lived inside. Within 2 years of the Act's passage, Treasury agents were arresting physicians for maintaining addicted patients on opiate prescriptions. The prosecutions were not rare events or extreme outliers, they were systematic. Between 1914 and 1938, more than 25,000 physicians were arrested under the Harrison Act. Approximately 3,000 went to prison. The medical profession, which had spent decades failing to address the opiate addiction problem it had helped create, was now being criminally prosecuted for trying to treat it. The effect on patients was immediate and catastrophic. Physicians who'd been maintaining thousands of addicted patients on stable, clean, medically supervised opiate prescriptions stopped doing so overnight, not because they wanted to abandon their patients, but because continuing meant risking their medical licenses and their freedom. Patients who had been functional, employed, and medically stable on maintenance doses were suddenly without supply. They did not stop needing opiates. Their physiological dependence did not dissolve because a Treasury agent had arrested their doctor. They found other sources. The street market for heroin, which had been growing since Bayer's withdrawal in 1913, expanded with extraordinary speed to fill the gap the Harrison Act had created. Prices rose, purity dropped. The patients who had been obtaining pharmaceutical-grade morphine from licensed physicians were now obtaining adulterated heroin from criminal suppliers at dramatically higher prices and dramatically higher risk. Overdose deaths among this population increased. Disease spread through the injection equipment that became standard when the cost of the drug made more economical administration methods necessary. The Harrison Act had taken a medical problem and made it a criminal one, and in doing so had made it substantially worse. Meanwhile, the patent medicines had not disappeared. The 1906 Act had forced ingredient disclosure, but it had not banned opiate-containing products. In the years between 1906 and 1914, the market had adjusted. Products with high opiate concentrations had been reformulated or rebranded. The morphine content of Mrs. Winslow's had been reduced. Some products had disappeared entirely, unable to survive the reputational damage of a label that now honestly stated what they contained. But the market for milder opiate preparations, cough syrups with small amounts of codeine, digestive tonics with trace opium, sedatives with minor narcotic content, continued robustly through the 1910s and into the 1920s. The Harrison Act's reach into this space was uncertain and inconsistently applied. Products classified as patent medicines existed in a legal grey zone that enforcement agents were not particularly interested in clarifying, partly because the manufacturers were not the politically convenient target that immigrant physicians in urban neighbourhoods were, and partly because the commercial and lobbying infrastructure protecting these products remained formidable. What the 1910s did accomplish, through the combined effect of the 1906 Act, the Harrison Act, changing medical opinion and slowly shifting public attitudes, was a gradual denormalization of opiate use as routine domestic medicine. The generation of parents who'd grown up with soothing syrups in the household medicine cabinet was giving way to a generation that had been told, with increasing consistency, that these products were dangerous. The cultural permission that had sustained the market for 60 years was eroding. It eroded slowly, unevenly, with significant regional variation. Rural America in the 1920s was still a place where patent medicines with opiate content could be purchased at general stores without much friction. The distribution network that had built the patent medicine empire took time to dismantle, not because the products were still being heavily advertised in the old way, but because they had become embedded in local commercial habit. The druggist who had sold Godfrey's equivalent to 3 generations of the same family didn't stop selling it because a law had passed in Washington. He stopped when the supply chain dried up, when the manufacturers reformulated, when the product simply became unavailable rather than banned. The legal architecture that actually ended the soothing syrup era was less dramatic than either the reformers or the manufacturers had imagined. It was not a single decisive legislative moment. It was a slow accumulation of regulatory pressure, reformulated products, shifting medical opinion, and commercial decisions by manufacturers who calculated that the legal and reputational risk of their old formulas now exceeded the profit. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup quietly disappeared from American pharmacy shelves around 1930. There was no announcement, no legal proceeding, no accountability moment. The product that had been sold for 90 years, that had been the subject of medical condemnation for 60 of those years, that had been named in coroner's verdicts and parliamentary debates and medical journal articles and congressional testimony, simply stopped being made. The bottles were not recalled, the formula was not published, the company issued no statement acknowledging what the product had been and what it had done. The death toll it had contributed to over 9 decades was never officially calculated, never formally acknowledged, never assigned to anyone's legal responsibility. It just stopped. That ending, quiet, unaccountable, commercially motivated rather than morally compelled, was characteristic of how the entire patent medicine era resolved. Not with justice, not with reckoning. With a gradual commercial retreat that left every structural condition that had enabled the era intact, ready to be reactivated by the next industry that discovered the same formula, trusted distribution channels, captured regulators, financial leverage over the press, and a product that worked just well enough, just long enough, that by the time the damage became undeniable, the profit had already been extracted and the responsible parties were either dead or untouchable. The infrastructure of harm had not been dismantled. It had simply found nothing profitable to run through it at the moment. That moment would not last. History tends to focus on the dead. They're easier to count, easier to document, easier to build a narrative around. The Victorian infant opiate story has its death records, its coroner's verdicts, its named cases and estimated tolls. But the dead were a fraction of the exposed. The majority of the children who received soothing syrups, Godfrey's cordial, heroin cough preparations and cocaine toothache drops did not die from them. They survived. And what survival looked like, what it meant neurologically, physiologically, and across the arc of a life, is a question that medical science spent most of the 20th century not asking and has only recently begun to answer. The first clue that survival carried its own consequences came not from research, but from observation, and the observers were the same pharmacists and physicians who'd been watching the soothing syrup culture for decades. When a mother who had been using Mrs. Winslow's regularly decided to stop, because the supply was unavailable, because a doctor had finally warned her, because the product had been reformulated and the new version didn't seem to work as well, something happened to the baby that the mother hadn't expected. The infant became inconsolable. Not the ordinary crying of hunger or discomfort, but something more desperate and more relentless. A thin, high-pitched sound that experienced mothers described as different from any cry they had heard before. The baby trembled. It sweated despite cool temperatures. It refused to feed, then fed frantically, then vomited. It could not sleep regardless of how exhausted it obviously was. These were the symptoms of neonatal opiate withdrawal. The clinical term did not exist yet in the Victorian medical vocabulary, but the phenomenon was being observed and recorded in scattered case notes by physicians who recognized it without having the framework to fully name it. Some of these physicians attributed the symptoms to the underlying illness the syrup had been treating, the teething, the colic, the respiratory complaint, returning with renewed force now that the medicine had been stopped. This interpretation was exactly backwards. The illness they were seeing was the medicine's absence. The neurological implications of this observation are significant and disturbing in ways that extend far beyond the immediate withdrawal episode. For an opiate to produce withdrawal symptoms, it must have produced physical dependence. Physical dependence in an adult requires weeks to months of regular use. In an infant, whose nervous system is in active development, and whose neurological architecture is being constructed in real time, the timeline is compressed. Infants can develop measurable physical dependence on opiates within days of regular exposure. The developing brain is not just more sensitive to opiates than the adult brain. It is actively incorporating the drug's presence into its own structural development. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological mechanism. The opioid receptors that develop in a brain exposed to regular exogenous opiates during infancy develop differently than those in an unexposed brain. The dopamine reward pathways that opiates engage, the same pathways implicated in adult addiction, are being laid down during infancy, and they are being laid down in the presence of a powerful artificial stimulant. The blueprint being constructed during those critical developmental months is not the blueprint of an unexposed brain. What that means across a lifetime is something that researchers are still working to fully establish. But the emerging picture is not reassuring. Studies of neonatal opiate exposure, conducted primarily on infants born to addicted mothers in the modern era, since direct study of Victorian infants is obviously impossible, show measurable differences in cognitive development, impulse control, and stress response regulation that persist well beyond the newborn period. Children with significant neonatal opiate exposure show higher rates of attention and behavioral difficulties in early childhood. Adolescents with documented neonatal exposure show altered neurological responses to stress and reward that resemble, in structural terms, patterns associated with elevated addiction risk. These studies are conducted with subjects whose exposure is documented, whose medical histories are known, and whose outcomes can be tracked. The Victorian infants had none of these things working in their favour. Their exposure was undocumented, inconsistent, and varied enormously in duration and concentration, depending on which product their mothers used, how frequently they used it, and for how long. Some infants received a few doses over a few weeks. Others received daily dosing for months or years. The range of exposure was enormous, and it was distributed across an enormous population. The working-class districts of industrial Britain in the mid to late 1800s had, in the most literal physiological sense, been conducting a massive uncontrolled experiment on the developing nervous systems of their infant population for decades. The results of that experiment moved forward in time with those infants as they grew into children and then adults, carrying neurological alterations that nobody had documented, nobody was tracking, and nobody had any framework for connecting to their origins. The historical data that exists around addiction rates in the late Victorian and Edwardian working class is suggestive in ways that are difficult to evaluate precisely because the confounding variables are so numerous. Working class communities in industrial Britain had high rates of alcohol dependence. They had high rates of laudanum use among adults. They had poor nutrition, chronic stress, inadequate housing, and all the social determinants of addiction that operate entirely independently of any neurological predisposition. Disentangling the contribution of infant opiate exposure from these other factors is, for the Victorian population, essentially impossible. But the question itself is important, and it had not been seriously asked until very recently. Medical historians who have examined the infant opiate story through a neurodevelopmental lens have begun to suggest that the soothing syrup era may have had population-level effects on the neurological development of working-class communities that were subtle enough to be invisible in any individual case, but significant in aggregate. Not everyone exposed was affected in the same way. Neurological development is not uniform, and the brain has considerable capacity for compensation and adaptation. But if even a fraction of the millions of infants regularly dosed with opiate preparations in the Victorian era showed the kinds of altered reward pathway development that modern neonatal exposure studies suggest is possible, the cumulative effect on those communities would have been real, lasting, and entirely unacknowledged. The other category of survivors carries a different kind of damage, and it is better documented. The children who survived the soothing syrup era grew up in a medical culture that continued to prescribe opiates liberally for the entirety of their adult lives. A Victorian infant who had received regular morphine dosing for the first year of his life, who had undergone neonatal withdrawal without it being recognised as such, who carried the neurological signatures of early opiate exposure into adulthood, that person, when they presented to a doctor with chronic pain in middle age and were prescribed morphine for it, was not starting from the same baseline as a person without that history. The medical profession of the late Victorian and Edwardian era did not know this. It had no concept of developmental neurotoxicology, no understanding of how early drug exposure altered lifetime neurological function, and no mechanism for connecting a 50-year-old man's rapid development of morphine dependence to the soothing syrup he'd received as an infant in 1865. The casualties of the soothing syrup era therefore extended in time far beyond the era itself. They moved through the medical system as adults, accumulating diagnoses and prescriptions that their history made them disproportionately vulnerable to, and dying of conditions, addiction, overdose, the physical consequences of long-term opiate dependence, that the death records of the early 20th century attributed to their adult circumstances rather than to their infant ones. The era had also created a specific category of child casualty that was recognized at the time but quickly absorbed into more comfortable explanations. These were the children who were described in Victorian and Edwardian medical literature as constitutionally weak, nervous, slow to develop, or of deficient vitality. Children who had received heavy or prolonged opiate dosing in infancy, and who showed, as they grew, the developmental delays and neurological irregularities that chronic early opiate exposure can produce. These children were understood as unfortunate products of heredity or of the general conditions of poverty, and heredity and poverty were certainly real factors, but the specific pharmacological contribution of their infant medical history was invisible to the professionals assessing them. Some of these children ended up in Victorian institutions for the feeble-minded, a category that covered an enormous range of actual conditions, and that absorbed many individuals whose difficulties had pharmacological rather than constitutional origins. Once inside the institutional system, their outcomes were determined by the institution rather than by any understanding of what had actually happened to them. The records of these institutions are among the most harrowing documents in Victorian social history, and they contain, embedded in their careful bureaucratic language, the final accounting of what the soothing syrup era had done to its most vulnerable survivors. Children who'd been drugged before they could speak, who had developed and grown in the presence of chemicals their caregivers never questioned, who had been failed at every structural level by every institution that should have protected them, filed under weak constitution, hereditary deficiency, and unknown cause. Unknown cause. The phrase had followed these children from the cradle, through the death records of their siblings, into the institutional ledgers where their own stories ended. Unknown cause was the Victorian system's all-purpose absolution, a bureaucratic shrug that closed the file, erased the question, and protected every party that might otherwise have been held to account. The questions being erased were about to become very loud again, just not in Victorian England, in a different country, in a different century, with a different drug, but with a corporate playbook that would have been entirely recognisable to the men who invented Mrs. Winslow. In 1995, Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin to the American market. The drug was oxycodone, a powerful synthetic opioid, in a time-release formulation that Purdue claimed made it safer and less addictive than immediate-release opioids. The company's medical director told physicians that the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. The sales force repeated this figure in doctors' offices across the country with the confidence of people who had been told to believe it, and had done so completely. The claim was not supported by clinical evidence. Purdue knew this. The internal documents that would later emerge through litigation, thousands of pages of memos, emails, and marketing analyses, showed that Purdue Pharma had been receiving reports of OxyContin abuse, diversion, and addiction from its own sales representatives within the first year of the drug's launch. By 1997, 2 years into the product's commercial life, internal communications acknowledged that the time-release mechanism that was supposed to prevent abuse could be defeated by simply crushing the tablet. Crushing it eliminated the time-release effect and delivered the full opioid dose instantly, exactly the profile that made the drug highly attractive for recreational use and highly dangerous for anyone without opiate tolerance. Purdue continued marketing OxyContin as a low addiction risk medication for another decade. The parallel to Bayer's heroin campaign is not metaphorical. It is structural, tactical, and in some respects almost embarrassingly direct. Bayer had introduced a powerful opioid to a market that was looking for a non-addictive alternative to morphine, claimed without adequate evidence that the drug was safe from dependency, distributed free samples to physicians, published favourable clinical data while suppressing unfavourable findings, and continued the campaign after internal evidence of addiction had accumulated to the point of certainty. Purdue did each of these things with more sophisticated tools, a larger budget, and in a regulatory environment that should have prevented all of it. The FDA approved OxyContin in 1995 based on a single clinical trial. The trial lasted only a few weeks, not long enough to establish long-term addiction risk in any meaningful sense. The approval label included a claim that the time-release formulation is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug, language that was, by the FDA's own admission in later investigations, not supported by the data submitted with the application. The agency approved a drug for long-term chronic pain management based on short-term trial data, included a safety claim that its own reviewers had questions about, and released it into a medical market that was, in the mid-1990s, being actively reshaped by a campaign to treat chronic pain more aggressively. That campaign was not organic, it had been cultivated. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, a movement within American medicine had been building around the idea that chronic pain was systematically undertreated, that physician reluctance to prescribe opioids was causing unnecessary suffering, and that the risks of addiction had been exaggerated by an overcautious medical establishment. This movement was funded in significant part by pharmaceutical companies with commercial interests in the expansion of opioid prescribing. It produced academic papers, clinical guidelines, and eventually a campaign by the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations that designated pain as the fifth vital sign, implying that untreated pain was a medical failure equivalent to ignoring a dangerously high fever. The infrastructure had been built before the product launched. When OxyContin arrived, it arrived into a medical culture that had been prepared to receive it, a culture that had been told that aggressive opioid prescribing was ethical medicine, that addiction concerns were overblown, and that the patients asking for more medication were patients in genuine pain rather than patients in dependency. The Victorian parallel is precise. The soothing syrup manufacturers had not simply sold a product, they had sold a worldview, that infant silence was infant health, that opiate sedation was therapeutic rest, that the mother who used the syrup was a good mother exercising sound judgment. Purdue did not simply sell a pill, they sold a worldview, that pain was undertreated, that opioids were safe in the right formulation, that the physician who prescribed aggressively was a compassionate physician responding to suffering. Both campaigns required a prior cultural shift before the commercial product could move at scale. Both invested heavily in producing that shift. The communities that OxyContin hit first and hardest were not randomly distributed. Purdue's sales strategy had specifically targeted rural areas in Appalachia, the rural South, and the Midwest. Regions with high rates of physically demanding labour, high rates of chronic pain from occupational injury, limited access to specialist pain care, and primary care physicians who were often the sole medical resource for large patient populations. These were communities where a physician might be responsible for thousands of patients, and where the promise of a safe, effective long-term pain solution was not just commercially attractive but genuinely compelling as medicine. They were also, not coincidentally, communities with limited political power, limited media visibility, and limited capacity to generate the kind of organised public response that might have accelerated regulatory action. The people dying first were dying quietly, in rural counties where the death records were being filed with causes like cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, the modern equivalent of convulsions and unknown causes in the Victorian registry. By the time the opioid crisis became a national media story in the mid-2000s, the death toll in these communities had already reached staggering proportions. The Centers for Disease Control would later calculate that between 1999 and 2019, nearly 250,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses alone, before accounting for the heroin and fentanyl deaths that the prescription epidemic had directly enabled by creating a large population of opioid-dependent people who turned to cheaper street alternatives when prescription access tightened. The total opioid death toll in America from 1999 to the present exceeds 500,000 people. That number is larger than American military deaths in World War II. It is a mass casualty event that unfolded over 25 years in slow motion, documented in real time by medical examiners and public health researchers, reported in newspapers and congressional hearings and FDA advisory committee meetings, and it was allowed to continue for 2 decades before the regulatory and legal response achieved sufficient force to materially alter the trajectory. The reasons it was allowed to continue are identical to the reasons the soothing syrup era continued for 60 years after the first medical warnings. The pharmaceutical lobby was powerful and politically connected. The FDA's regulatory culture had structural weaknesses that industry had learned to exploit. The medical profession had been ideologically captured by a narrative that framed aggressive prescribing as ethical care. The community suffering most had the least political leverage. And the press, while not financially dependent on pharmaceutical advertising in the Victorian way, operated in a media environment where complex, slow-moving public health stories competed for space with more immediately dramatic content. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy in 2019 in a settlement structured to protect the Sackler family's personal wealth while technically resolving the legal claims against the company. The family that had extracted an estimated $11 billion in profits from OxyContin before the bankruptcy was allowed, through the settlement's original structure, to receive legal immunity from civil suits in exchange for contributing a portion of that wealth to remediation funds. The legal maneuver was challenged, contested, and partially overturned by the Supreme Court in 2024. But the underlying dynamic, a family that had knowingly fueled an addiction epidemic seeking to purchase legal immunity with a fraction of the profits from that epidemic, captured something essential about the continuity between the Victorian era and the modern one. Curtis and Perkins, who invented Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and the fictional woman on the label, died wealthy and unaccountable. The Sackler family had pursued the same exit with more lawyers and a more complex financial structure, but the destination was identical. Profit extracted, damage denied, accountability deferred until the principles were beyond its reach. The specific mechanism that allowed both stories to happen was not greed. Greed is universal and requires no explanation. The mechanism was the regulatory gap, the space between what was known and what was actionable, between the evidence that existed and the institution capable of acting on it. In the Victorian era, that gap was enormous because the regulatory institutions didn't exist yet. In the modern era, the gap existed because the regulatory institutions that did exist had been systematically weakened, underfunded, and in certain critical moments, actively manipulated by the industries they were meant to oversee. The children receiving heroin cough syrup in 1900 and the teenagers crushing OxyContin tablets in rural Kentucky in 2003 were separated by a century of medical progress, regulatory development, and accumulated historical knowledge about exactly this kind of harm. That knowledge had not protected the teenagers. The century between them had not closed the gap. It had just made the gap more expensive to maintain. In 2013, the World Health Organization issued a global advisory recommending that codeine, one of the most widely prescribed opioids in the world, should not be administered to children under 12 for any reason. Not for coughs, not for pain, not for any clinical indication whatsoever. The advisory was based on accumulated evidence that children metabolize codeine unpredictably, that some children convert it to morphine at rates far exceeding adult norms, and that deaths had been documented in children who received standard prescribed doses. The year was 2013, not 1880, not 1920. Not some era before the neurological effects of opiates on developing brains were understood. The WHO issued this warning 115 years after Bayer had introduced heroin as a children's cough medicine, 150 years after Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup had been identified as a source of infant deaths in British medical journals, and decades after the medical profession had formally acknowledged that opiates and children were a combination requiring extreme caution. Codeine had been prescribed to children continuously throughout that entire period. The specific cases that triggered the 2013 advisory were not obscure or disputed. Several children in North America had died after receiving codeine following tonsillectomy, a routine surgical procedure performed on hundreds of thousands of children annually. The deaths were investigated, the mechanism was identified, the FDA issued warnings, and the WHO followed. The response was appropriate. The response also arrived approximately a century after it should have, given that the fundamental pharmacological principle involved, that opiates suppress respiration in dose-dependent ways that are unpredictable in pediatric populations, had been established in the Victorian medical literature. This is not a minor observation. It is the central observation of this entire history. The knowledge that should have prevented harm existed in each generation before the harm occurred. Victorian physicians knew that opium suppressed respiration. They prescribed it to infants anyway. Early 20th century researchers knew that heroin caused dependence in adults. They recommended it for children's coughs anyway. Mid-century pharmacologists understood that codeine was metabolized variably, and that children were more sensitive to opioid effects than adults. Pediatric codeine prescriptions continued uninterrupted for decades anyway. The gap between knowing and acting was not a gap of ignorance. It was a gap of institutional will, commercial interest, and regulatory capture, and it recurred in each generation with a consistency that suggests it is not an accident but a feature. The modern wellness industry has rebuilt significant portions of the Victorian patent medicine architecture with updated branding. The structural elements are identical in ways that reward close examination. Products with proprietary formulas marketed through testimonials and emotional appeals rather than clinical evidence. Ingredient lists that disclose without explaining. Naming compounds that sound natural and therefore safe to consumers who have no framework for evaluating them. Claims that exist in the regulatory grey zone between medicine and food supplement, specific enough to be persuasive, vague enough to avoid the burden of clinical proof. Marketing that targets parental anxiety about children's health with the same emotional precision that Mrs. Winslow's advertisements used in 1870. The specific substances are different. The regulatory framework is more developed, if unevenly applied. The death toll from any single modern wellness product is unlikely to match the Victorian soothing syrups at their worst. But the fundamental commercial logic is unchanged. Find the gap between what parents fear and what medicine can reliably deliver. Fill that gap with a product, and protect the product with a marketing investment large enough to outpace the regulatory response. The supplement industry in the United States operates under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, a law that placed the burden of proving harm on regulators rather than the burden of proving safety on manufacturers. Under this framework, a supplement can be sold without any pre-market safety review. The FDA can act against a supplement only after harm has been demonstrated, which requires harm to occur and be documented and attributed and acted upon, a process that takes years and during which the product continues to be sold to the population it is harming. The 1994 Act was passed with significant lobbying support from the supplement industry. It was described by its supporters as a consumer freedom measure. It was, in functional terms, the closest thing to the pre-1906 patent medicine environment that the modern regulatory system contains. An industry that wanted to sell products without proving they were safe had identified the exact legislative vehicle it needed and had driven it through Congress with a sophistication that Harvey Wiley, fighting the same battle a century earlier, would have recognized immediately. The children's supplement market is one of the fastest growing segments of the industry. Products targeting infant sleep, toddler immunity, childhood concentration, and adolescent anxiety are marketed directly to parents through social media channels with testimonial-based evidence structures that differ from Victorian newspaper advertising only in their technological delivery mechanism. The mother who bought Mrs. Winslow's because a neighbour recommended it in 1875, and the parent who buys a children's melatonin gummy because an influencer recommended it in 2023 are making the same epistemic transaction. Trusting a social endorsement over absent clinical evidence in a regulatory environment that has not required the clinical evidence to exist. Melatonin is not morphine. The comparison is not about equivalent danger. It is about equivalent structure, the structure of a commercial system that prioritizes market entry over safety proof, that uses social trust to substitute for clinical evidence, and that places the regulatory burden on the side that has the least resources to carry it. The genuinely dangerous modern parallels are not in the wellness aisle. They are in the prescription drug system, which the OxyContin story has already illustrated, and which has not been fundamentally reformed by the legal proceedings against Purdue. The opioid settlement money flows into state and county remediation funds at a pace that does not match the ongoing death toll. The FDA's drug approval process retains the structural weaknesses, short trial durations, surrogate endpoint reliance, post-market surveillance inadequacy that allowed OxyContin through in 1995. The pharmaceutical industry's financial relationship with medical education, clinical guideline development, and continuing physician education remains deeply entangled in ways that the post-OxyContin regulatory response has addressed incompletely. The specific people who made the specific decisions that created the modern opioid crisis have largely not faced consequences proportionate to the harm they caused. Richard Sackler, who drove OxyContin's aggressive marketing strategy as Purdue's president and later chairman, has not been criminally charged. Former Purdue executives who pleaded guilty to federal charges related to OxyContin marketing received sentences that the families of overdose victims described with considerable accuracy as inadequate. The FDA reviewers whose decisions enabled OxyContin's approval and labeling have faced no professional accountability. This pattern, harm at scale, profit extracted, accountability diffused until it disappears, runs from Curtis and Perkins in the 1840s to the Sacklers in the 2020s with a continuity that is not coincidental. It is the predictable output of a system in which the incentives for creating pharmaceutical harm are large and immediate, while the consequences for causing it are delayed, uncertain, and ultimately manageable with sufficient legal and financial resources. What would actually break the pattern is a question that this history raises with considerable force. The Victorian reformers believed the answer was disclosure. Label the ingredients and consumers will protect themselves. The 1906 Act proved that disclosure without enforcement was insufficient. The Progressive-era reformers believed the answer was federal oversight. The FDA was created and was captured. The post-thalidomide reformers of the 1960s believed the answer was rigorous pre-market safety requirements. Those requirements were applied inconsistently and eroded over time by industry pressure. The post-OxyContin reformers believe the answer is criminal accountability for executives and reformed prescribing guidelines. Those measures are underway and are already being resisted with the full weight of the pharmaceutical lobbying apparatus. Each generation of reformers has been right about the specific fix they proposed. Each fix has been implemented imperfectly, applied inconsistently, and gradually eroded by the commercial forces it was designed to constrain. The pattern suggests that the problem is not any specific regulatory gap, but the underlying power asymmetry between the industries that profit from pharmaceutical harm and the institutions designed to prevent it, an asymmetry that has persisted across every regulatory regime, every era of reform, and every generation that believed it had finally learned the lesson of the one before. The Victorian doctors who prescribed heroin to children were not, for the most part, evil. They were operating within a system of incentives, cultural assumptions, commercial relationships, and institutional structures that made prescribing heroin to children seem reasonable, and that ensured the people best positioned to challenge that reasonableness had the most to lose from doing so. The Purdue sales representatives who told physicians that OxyContin's addiction risk was less than 1% were not for the most part evil either. They were repeating what they had been told by people who had calculated that the lie was profitable and the consequences were manageable. The system that produced both of these outcomes is the same system. It has different products in it now. It has more lawyers and more sophisticated lobbying tools and a much larger budget for the kind of regulatory capture that used to require only newspaper advertising contracts. But the architecture, profit from trust, suppress the evidence, distribute the blame, outlast the outrage, has not changed in any fundamental way since a man named Jeremiah Curtis put a fictional woman's face on a bottle of morphine and told the mothers of industrial England that she knew what their babies needed. She didn't exist. The damage did. It still does. It is quieter now, distributed across more products and more populations and more carefully managed public relations campaigns. The bottles look different. The labels are more honest, at least in the markets where honesty is legally required. The fictional women have been replaced by fictional clinical studies and real-seeming endorsements from real-seeming physicians who receive real payment for their apparent independence. The babies in the cradles are different babies. The system rocking the cradle is the same system, and somewhere, in a boardroom that looks nothing like a Victorian pharmacy but functions exactly like one, someone is reading a report about a new product, looking at the data showing what the product actually does versus what the marketing will claim it does, calculating the gap between those two things in units of profit and legal exposure, and making a decision. The same decision that has been made in rooms like that for nearly 200 years.